Hello. Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi there.
Hi, Al.
Hi,
Hi, Robert.
Rabbi. You should introduce the people, the new people, maybe.
Okay.
But let's wait to have more people.
All right.
איזה פרשה אנחנו?
משפטים.
משפטים. Okay.
Hi, Gavi. We'll just wait a minute or two for people to come in.
Is the book club finished?
Yeah, just finished. Okay. Hi, Oli.
Hi, Rabbi. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Meyer. Hi, Gavi. Okay, I think we'll start. It's late, so I think we'll start. Okay. I apologize about the time change. Once a month, we have a book club. So we push off the class because, as we said last time, Tadir Shemot Tadir Kodem. It's been going on for almost close to 10 years, close to a decade, Bianara, and Dan is the chairman. So Lichvodo, we push the shiur off once a week. Once a month. I just want to say that next week. Sorry?
Nothing, go ahead.
I want to say the next week, Bezrat Hashem, for the next 2 weeks, we'll be changing the topic of the class, just pre-Purim. Instead of Parashat HaShavua, we will try and analyze a little bit Megillat Esther. And we'll be doing it with Rashi and the Perush of the Gaon Mivilna. The Vilna Gaon is one of the primary commentators on Megillat Esther, and one of the most famous ones. Just nice to see a bit of a different perspective of the story of Haman, story of Esther. I think it will be nice just in preparation for Purim for the next 2 weeks to have that. So B'ezrat Hashem next week, come with your Megillat Esther. Okay, so just coming back to the topic of the day, this week's parasha, Parashat Mishpatim. Now the truth is, until now we've been having lots of stories, we've had lots of discussion, different people, different types of people. We had, Sefer Bereshit was full of lots of drama. We had Sefer Shemot. Until now, we had pretty much, Paro, Moshe, the Jewish people. going on, the Bnei Israel going out, in Mitzrayim, coming out of Mitzrayim. And last week, finally, we ended off with Yitro, with the whole thing with the desert, where the father-in-law of Moshe comes and brings Moshe's family. And later on, the end of the parasha was the climax, the great revelation, the revelation of Har Sinai, where essentially God gives the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, to the Jewish people. Hi, Alan. That's until now. From now going forward, Ve'ela Mishpatim, this week's parasha, is a bit of a change in character, if you want, in the Torah. And going on forward, Terumah, Tetzaveh, is pretty much about the Mishkan, about the Kohanim, about the clothes, and the different types of things, different elements of the Mishkan. Kitisai talks about the break with the Egel, with the golden calf, the sin of the golden calf. Vayakha Pekudah kind of wraps up Sever Shemot with basically how they actually built the Mishkan. So Mishpatim is really where it kind of starts, the digression begins. So you'll see, as opposed to all the parashah which we had till now, we have a completely different style, less story type. But I want to bring to your attention one idea before we get into Ve'ela Mishpatim, what's it about, who, what, where. I want to quickly just point out one idea which comes up because it pretty much continues what we discussed last week. So I'll bring to your attention, if we turn to the very end of the parasha. So we have lots of different laws, lots of civil laws, which Torah goes through. We're going to jump to Perek Chavdalet, and we'll go back to the beginning after we finish this. Perek Chavdalet, chapter 24. And the pasuk says as follows: Ve'el Moshe amar aleh el Hashem, ata va'aron dav avihu shivim ziknei Yisrael v'ishtachavitem merachok. And to Moses he said, go up to Hashem, you, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and you shall prostrate yourselves from a distance. V'nigash Moshe levado el Hashem ve'emo yigashu ve'am aliyahu imo.
Is it
Sorry? Perek Chavdaled, chapter 24, pasuk Aleph.
Aleph.
Pasuk Bet, and Moses alone shall approach Hashem, they shall not approach, right at the beginning, and the people shall not go up with him. Moses came and told the people the words of Hashem and all the ordinances. The entire people responded with one voice, and they said, famous words, all the words that Hashem had spoken, we will do. No, not quite, not yet famous. ויכתוב משה את כל דברי השם וישכיב בבוקר ויגבם מזבח תחת ההר 12 מצבה 12 שבטי ישראל וישלח נערי ישראל. So on and so forth. פסוק זין, פסוק 7, ויקח ספר הברית ויקרא באוזני העם ויאמרו כל אשר דיבר אדוני נעשה ונשמע. Moses took half the blood and placed it in basins, took the book of the covenant, read in the Israel people. He said, everything that Hashem had spoken, we will do. And we will obey the magic words.
Rabbi,
yes,
in chapter Yutet Chet, they're saying it too. והיינו כל העם יחדיו ואמרו כל אשר דיבר אדוני נעשה.
Okay, can you see the difference?
No, but they're already saying that.
Yeah, but הם לא אמרו...
They said נעשה, they didn't say
נעשה. But this is the first time that they say, as the rabbi said, the famous na'aseh v'nishma.
But usually you need to listen and then you need to do.
That's so
okay.
unique.
So that's why it's so unique, because it's na'aseh v'nishma. They first said we'll do, we accept basically, and then we're going to hear. Now the Gemara in Shabbat actually goes at length to discuss exactly what was this like kind of magic formula. The Gemara says that that for each one of these words they received a separate crown. So now say they got one crown, Nishma they got another crown, whatever that means, the spiritual element. And basically 600,000 Jews got 120,000 crowns. That's 1.5 million crowns. 1.5, 1.2. So the truth is, I don't want to go into the concept of Naseh v'Nishma. It's a bit of a discussion. Why only over here? We learn in school Naseh v'Nishma happened before. It means the Jews accept whatever was going on, and then they go ahead and receive the Torah. I would just point out the Gemara in Shabbat actually says that there was a certain rabbi, and he was a Abaye or rabbi, I can't remember. He was learning so hard that he put his finger in the bench, and his finger started bleeding. And the Gemara says that this heretic turns around to him. He says, "You foolish people! Look at you! You're studying so hard. You didn't realize your finger is bleeding, and look how silly you are. You know what you are? You've always been the same. Why?" He says, "I'm a peziza. The kadme pamayu apaihu." He says, you talk before you think. Why? Because in Naseh v'Nishma, you said we'll do, and then we'll listen. He said, look what you're doing. Look, you're messing up. Your finger's bleeding. You're so busy learning Torah. You're just not using your brain. Now, so what exactly is the greatness of Naseh v'Nishma? Put it mildly, the way the Gemara explains it is that the Jewish people had such faith in God, their creator, that they knew if mommy gives you something, if daddy gives you something, you don't know what it is, he's giving you a present, his most cherished present, cherished possession, you don't ask, I'm not sure, let me check it out. You take it. Naaseh v'nishma. The mere fact they're able to turn around to God and say, Naaseh v'nishma, kind of solidified what their relationship with God was. What does it look like? It looks like our connection to God is so wholesome that we'll trust you blindfold in that sense. Now, we don't believe in the concept of not asking questions and all that. We're prepared to ask, but first we accept. Ron Lay was talking last week, by the way, on Friday morning. We have a very great breakfast discussion. Ron will be leading the week. It's Rosh Chodesh, so it'll be at 8:15 instead of at 8 o'clock. But the talk, we start Shachri at 7:30 on Zoom. But he wants to suggest that Judaism evolves around different levels. There's a certain level of where everybody conforms to certain guidelines, namely halakha. And then once we all have that, formality where we follow guidelines, then every person has his or hers uniqueness in how that comes out. But there's a certain level of where we all conform to one guided light kind of thing. And that was everyone around Har Sinai, all forming around the mountain. It's interesting to note that next week's parasha, the Ramban talks about this, Nachmanides talks about this at length, that what happened with the Mishkan was pretty much, Ma'amad Har Sinai was pretty much the picture of Har Sinai being taken into real life. So there is everyone around the mountain, there's different levels, there's Moshe Rabbeinu, there's Aaron, there's Zekinim, there's the Jewish people all around the mountain. So it's all focused around one central goal. The same thing with Mishkan. You had the Mishkan, which was in the center. You had Machaneh, or you had the Kohanim in the middle, and you had Leviim, then you had the Israelim, and so on and so forth. You had the different levels, all again centralized around the Mishkan, Kodesh Kodashim. So that's like a similar theme, a similar dimension, which you find in next parasha. That's a continuation of next parasha. So it breaks down from Har Sinai to the laws in this week's parasha, and then to next week's parasha is the actual bringing that element into our daily lives. Okay, but we're going now. What I want to point out is that this story seems a little out of place. Because we know Naseh v'Nishma happened before they received the Torah. God asked them, do you want it? They say Naseh v'Nishma, and then God reveals himself at Har Sinai. So Rashi, if you want to jump into Rashi says straight away, Pasuk Aleph, Perek Chavdalet Pasuk Aleph, chapter 24, Pasuk 1. Vel Moshe Amar, Parsha zu ne'emra kodem aseret hadibrot. This parasha, this story, actually took place before the Ten Commandments. Okay? Rashi says this again a little later. Can everybody hear me? My internet's a bit slow
You're a
today.
bit frozen, yeah, like you're not moving much.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. If I freeze, just put up your hand and maybe I'll move to a different room. Okay. Rashi says it later on again. I just really want to point out this idea that it's actually strange, because if we look through the psukim, okay, let me break it down for you. So you've got Rashi says that this happened all before Matan Torah. That means the Torah is not written in chronological order, like we spoke about last week, and this whole portion should actually be put before the right bang in the middle, essentially, of last week's parasha. So Yitro comes, they come out around the mountain, and this is where this whole piece should be inserted. Okay. There's a couple of interesting points which you have to try and kind of figure out. So Ramban, Nachmanides really doesn't like this. Right? He says, no, it doesn't make sense. And he got a couple of questions. He says, first of all, if you look at the Pasuk, it says, in Pasuk Gimel, Pasuk 3, Vayavo Moshe ve'yisaper la'am et kol divrei Adonai ve'et kol ha'mishpatim. Moses came and told the people all the words of Hashem and all the ordinances, all the commandments, and then they responded with Naaseh. So says Ramban, I don't understand what's going on. Which wording is he saying? Which laws is he talking about? Says Ramban, I believe this parasha actually happened afterwards, not before, and that's what he was saying was the whole Parashat Mishpatim, all Matan Torah, everything which he told them the past 2 weeks, and that's why this comes in its place. That's Ramban's opinion. Even Rashi, who says that this is out of place, actually has to kind of, cut and paste over here, because Rashi says, Rashi says in Pasuk 12, God says to Moses, ascend to me to the mountain and remain there. I shall give you the tablets. We pointed out last week that the tablets actually weren't given at Matan Torah, at the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were not given at Har Sinai. Yeah, it was only, at the revelation. It was only 40 days later. Moshe Rabbeinu goes to be with God up at the top of the mountain. Then Moshe Rabbeinu comes down with the 2 tablets. And that's when he sees, this is Parashat Ki Tisa, it's in 3 weeks' time, where they're actually dancing around the idol worship of the golden calf. Moshe gets angry and he throws them down. That's pretty much the breakdown of the Luchot. But Rashi says over here, Pasuk Yudbet, Pasuk 12, Vayomer Adonai Moshe. Now Rashi jumps, he says, this already happened Lachar Matan Torah. You really have to kind of cut and paste, according to Rashi. The first part is before Matan Torah, the second part is after Matan Torah, and kind of really kitschy kind of thing. Exactly where to put what. It's not very systematic, definitely not very chronologically written. So I just want to point out, we said last week, there are Machloket Rashi and Ramban about when Yitro came. Did he come before? Did he come after Matan Torah? Were the children there? Were the children not there? Children of Moshe Rabbeinu. And we said there's a machloket about it. I just want to point out that this is a consistent theme between the Rishonim, which actually comes back from Mechilta, already comes back much, much earlier in the Talmud, already an argument exactly if the Torah is written in chronological order or not. And we see this again as an underlying theme throughout the parashah. Yes, yeah.
But how is it possible if God gave the Torah to Moshe? Or did Moshe got confused and wrote it differently and misplaced things? It doesn't sound
very good question. So
it's
it's a very good question,
Bible.
very fair question. So why would we need to have it like this? Is a very good question. And I suppose, so I did mention last week that certain things I asked of Shmuel Kamenetsky when I was in New York. I asked him, was there any specific reason, why the Torah would not be written in chronological order? He said, we don't necessarily know. In certain places, we understand why the Torah wants to put certain parts next to others. But really, we don't really have a fundamental understanding of why the Torah would kind of, put, a piece here and a piece there. And we kind of have to, according to Ramban, it makes sense. This is how it happened. But according to Rashi, it's difficult to understand. But again, in certain places, we have explanations why we actually put it together. And it starts off with Rashi right at the beginning of the parasha. So this leads us on to our next discussion. Ve'ele hamishpatim, at the beginning of the parasha, Pasuk Aleph, chapter 21, Pasuk 1. Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. And these are the judgments, these are the ordinances, these are the laws that you should put in front of them, should place in front of them. Now, so really, Parshat Mishpatim is really a breakdown of civil law. It's very interesting to note that in the secular world, there's a great distinction between church and state. We don't mix. Religion and state are two separate things. As opposed to the Torah, there's no such thing. Religion and state is exactly the same thing. The judges go and give halachot with regards to religion, and there's religious laws with regards to a judicial system which is set up for, tort law, civil and tort law. And essentially what it is primarily to teach us that in every element of our lives, God is central to our lives. So whether it's about how we treat our fellow human, or our somebody who steals money, or somebody who goes and guards something and doesn't safeguard appropriately, and all the same thing is exactly the same idea as Anochi Hashem Lokecha. So the difference between Ben Adam Lamakom and Ben Adam Lechavero, the difference between laws of man to man and laws of man to his fellow are exactly the same. Ve'ele hamishpatim ashetzim lifnehem is kind of, if you want to know what the breakdown of Aseret HaDibrot is, you want to know what the breakdown of the Ten Commandments is, you should know it's all one package deal. It's 10 Commandments and the 613 Torah mitzvot in the Torah. And this is kind of the continuous theme. Rashi points out straight away, ve'ele is always there's an extra vav over here. Ve'ele, and these are the judgments. Rashi should have said, ele hamishpatim, these are the judgments, and they go ahead with a whole bunch of judgments and laws.
So
Yeah.
how do you manage this kind of a concept with the state of Israel? What takes place first? The laws of the Torah or the laws of the state? Sometimes they don't really work together.
Okay, so I don't really want to go into politics and secular law. The truth is, interesting to note, if we're really talking about the sixth parasha, of which many of it is talking to the Dayanim, how the Dayanim, the judges, will kind of enact and kind of be the keepers of the law, which is kind of consistent with what we just spoke about last week's parasha, Yitro, talking about the judges and exactly how the system should be, the judicial system should be set up. Then we have a Aseret HaDibrot, and then we have the continuation of how the judge should actually execute the law, the judicial system. But it's interesting to know, in Israel today, the chief rabbinate of Israel still have the legal standing of a secular court of law. So, for example, Chas Shalom, if there is a Mesarev Gitin, for example, someone, a big crisis in marriages, Bar Minan is when we have a system where a man refuses to give a get to his wife. Yeah, and from a halachic standard, then the man has got to give the get, the bill of divorce, to his wife, and if he doesn't, do it out of his own will, free will, then he can basically, the woman will stay undivorced, and that woman will never be able to get married again to another man. So she needs to be able to have this bill of divorce, and if she's not, she's what we call in a state of aguna. She's kind of in limbo, and she's not able to get married again. It's a very, very big problem internationally across the world. There are some husbands that use it as a ticket against their wives, and women who are very young with young children are often put through the grinder just because of this terrible, terrible situation. But in Israel, so around the world, it's much more complicated because there's no system set up for the Bet Din, for the Dayanim, to actually be able to impose on the husband to kind of force him and give him trouble if he doesn't want to, concede. As opposed to in Israel, because the Dayanim have a certain legal status, which can be enforced by the police, or the person can go to prison, they can stop the person from leaving the country, and so on and so forth. So Chief Rabbi has the option to, uphold the law from a halachic standard in such scenarios. So that's very helpful. Often, a person will go to Israel, he won't be able to leave the country unless he gives a get, to free his wife. So that's if you're talking about in secular law versus halachic law, there's definitely upside in Israel. But again, I mean, the state of Israel as it is currently is not the way it would be under Torah law, where the system will be a just system as per the Torah's mandate. So that's Bezrat Hashem. When Mashiach comes, we'll have a very quite a different system. So coming back to Rashi, ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. These are the laws that you shall place before them. There are two problems which you come out from this pasuk. First of all, ve'ele sounds like it's continuation. What's a continuation from? Second of all, the wording is a little bit strange. Asher tasim lifnehem. That you should place before them. Rashi has trouble with that wording. It should be ve'ele mishpatim asher tilamdem. These are the laws that you should teach them. He's talking to Moshe, teach them to the Jewish people. Why are you saying such a long-winded way of placing the law before them? So Rashi deals with both these problems. Ve'ele hamishpatim, kol makom shneimar ele, sal et harishonim. Wherever it says these in the Torah, it says it's rejecting what has been stated previously. Ve'ele, and these laws, mosif al rishonim, it adds on the last part. Ma harishonim misinai, don't think that the Ten Commandments were the only things that were given at Sinai, but everything was given at Sinai, including all these laws. It'd be important to note to point out, Rav Saadia Gaon, one of the Gaonim, gives a letter about this, and he says that the Ten Commandments were kind of the 10 parts which you can kind of bracket the rest of the 613 mitzvot, 603 mitzvot, under these categories. You can categorize all your mitzvot under each category for itself. So it's the 10 Commandments, which has the entire Torah within them. Says Rashi, this is Eyal's question. So why did we juxtapose the passages talking about the Mizbeach, and there was the last six parasha, the last pasuk in the last six parasha, talking about Mizbeach, about the altar, and the connection between the six parasha. To come and teach you, you should place Sanhedrin adjacent to the Bet Mikdash. And what's this idea? Again, the same concept. The judges over here are the ones who are upholding the law, and the law is not something which is different to the rest of the Torah. Rather, the upholding of the law is to show that every mundane matter is centralized in Judaism. And because we don't separate church and state, therefore, parallel to Aseret HaDibrot was the next halachot, all about civil and tort law. That's pretty much the overall understanding of the connection between last six parasha and this six parasha.
So, Rabbi, you
just point out one more Rashi and then
Rabbi, you actually have clarified something that is that I'm hearing for the first time, that all of the other 603 mitzvot basically fall into one of those 10 categories. Up to this point, I had a problem understanding where each of them lied. So, there was the Aseret HaDibot, and where do all the other 603 in terms of their status fall? So you've said something like that I'm hearing for the first time.
This is the opinion of Saadia Gaon,
Hmm.
and this is a very famous opinion that the Aseret that they brought were 10 categories, where the rest of the Torah kind of falls in. And I'll explain. I'll point out in the Rashi a little bit later. I want to point out a very nice idea. So, okay, so I just want to kind of, discuss the immediate Pesukim, which talks about. I just want to point out one Rashi before I talk about the next parasha. Asher tasim lifnehem, bit of a weird wording, should be that you should place before them, that you should teach them. Says Rashi something very important, and this is what we talked about. Judaism is not afraid of questions, but also we need clarity. Amar lo HaKadosh, this is for you. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe. Shem said to Moses, Lo ta'aleh al da'atcha lemor. Lomar, shouldn't occur to you to say, Eshne la'hem ha'perek v'halacha 2 או 3 פעמים, לא שתהא סדורה בפיהם כמשנתה. ואיני מטריח עצמי להבינם, טמא הדבר פירושו. I'm going to teach them 2 or 3 times. They should know the halacha. Boom, you're good to go. Don't forget, we're trying to bring out the entire Torah, which the Jewish people have to study. There was no Mishnah, there was no Gemara. It was everything which was, it was only later on, generations later, when the Jews went through so many persecutions, that Rebbe Yehuda Nasi actually decided to redact the Mishnah and kind of put it into a simplified format. And then later on, when even that was not good enough, then we came onto the Talmud, and that was like the oral law was actually written. But all the oral law until that point was remembered by, at least the rabbis, the people who were the teachers. So Moshe Rabbeinu could have turned around and said, "Listen, guys, I'm teaching you once, twice, 3 times. Boom, you got it. Good to go. I'm not going to start explaining to you every little reasoning and all the backwards and forwards and all the understanding, all the subtleties." Says Rashi, "Lekach ne'emar asher tasim lifnehem." God told them, don't just tell them give them the principles. You have to explain them the reasoning. Keshulchan ha'aruch u'muchan le'echol lifnei ha'adam. Like a table that is set and prepared to be eaten. Not good enough. You have, all the food wrapped. It's going to be ready to eat. That's what we call the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, because Shulchan Aruch took all the halachot, took all the Talmud, took all the Mishnah, took all Torah Sheba'al Peh, and kind of put it down to simplified format of legal terms, kind of thing, on not just the principles, but all round. How do you keep Shabbat? What to keep the Shabbat? When you keep Shabbat? And why you keep Shabbat? That's really what Shulchan Aruch is, a simplified format. In fact, the Shulchan Aruch in his Akdama, in his introduction, actually writes, I wrote this, that a person should be able to go through the format every 30 days. So a person is supposed to go through the entire 4 sections of Shulchan Aruch, which kind of crosses the entire lifespan of a person, and every element of it, the chagim and the daily life, and from halachot as simplified as which shoe to put on first, the right shoe before the left shoe, and tie the left and tie the right, and then from how to go to be excused, how a person should be with one's wife, and how should the halacha keep when 2 people two plaintiffs are coming in front of the judges. You have the full spectrum of Torah law and halacha in Shulchan Aruch, codified, simplified, Shulchan Aruch, like a laden table. But I think this is a really spectacular Rashi, which tells us you want to teach someone, don't just give them the idea, the blanket plain statement. You can't, you want to understand law, don't just give them, there was such a story, this is what it is, this is what it is. You can come to law, to the court and say, we've seen this before, we've got a precedent to this, and it's good to go. What's the nuances? Makes no difference. Says Rashi, not true. You want to explain to someone something properly, you have to understand the subtleties. You have to explain to them 100% so a person to keep it. A person has to be educated in every element so that a person can keep it. If a person would just keep it as like a cold chicken, then it doesn't really do anything to the person. And then suddenly you have a question, and then everything goes out the window because you don't understand it. Says God to Moshe, it's got to be asher tasim lifnehem keshulchan aruch, like a laden table where a person has to go understand the nuances and the subtleties. Okay, I want to point out a little bit of an understanding of the next parasha. Now, immediately after this statement, we have the parasha of Eved Ivri, which, again, Eved Ivri is really not so relevant today. We don't buy slaves nowadays. We don't have slaves nowadays. But it does need a little bit of, I think there is an element to it which is very relevant to us. And I would like to kind of point that out a little bit. I should point out, though, before we get into that, is Ve'ele HaMishpatim, actually, Balaturim actually points out how many mitzvot are there in this parasha. There's actually 53 mitzvot, right? 53 commandments in this parasha. 42 of them are Ben Adam Lechavero, between man and man, and 11 of them are Ben Adam Lamakom, between man and God. How do you know how many of them are between man and man? Says the Balaturim, a very nice acronym, not an acronym, a very nice gematria, is Ve'ele, Vav Aleph Lamed Hey, is gematria 42. That you know there's 42 mitzvot Ben Adam Lechavero. Ve'ele HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem, which is put in front of them. It means that is the one which are interactive between man and man. Okay, that's just a cute idea. But there's a nice idea also. Just mention this because it's a nice idea. Hamishpatim, Eyal was talking about this last week about acronyms. But Balaturim, they say the Balaturim, you know who the Balaturim was? Balaturim was the son of the Rosh. Yeah, okay, just a bit of history. The Rosh lived in Spain, lived in Germany. The Rosh was the rabbi in Germany at the time, and there was some persecutions going on with the government. They had I think it was a problem with his Rebbe, they were running after him, and the Rosh realized he doesn't have a future in Germany, so he decided to skip the country, and he ended up in Spain. The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, who was such a great rabbi, lived before the Rambam, approximately 1,000 years ago. So he was such a great rabbi that he came to the place in Spain, and he was so great that they accepted him as the rabbi of the city, of essentially of the community. His son was there at the time. His son Rabbeinu Yaakov Balaturim, that is the Bal Haturim. So basically, and just by the way, for the record, often people say that Moroccan Sfaradim have very close connections or close affiliations to the Ashkenazim. And one of the reasons they say, I've seen this a few times brought down, is, like for example, Sifrei Torah, we Sfaradim, we usually have standing up Sifrei Torah with like a whole, box, a whole case. Ashkenazim have like long Sifrei Torah without the case, right? There are many also Moroccan customs, like the mezuzah. For example, Moroccans put it on a slant, Sfaradim put it not on an angle, put it straight up. A lot of nuances which are very closely connected between the Moroccan Sfaradim and the Ashkenazim. And they say because the Moroccan Sfaradim came from early Sfarad, from Spain at the time of the Rosh, and the Rosh being Ashkenazi, who became the community rabbi, many of the customs, once the Moroccans left Spain after the expulsion, or even prior to the expulsion, they took the influence from their Ashkenazic rabbi, and that's why many minhagim today are actually, by the Moroccans, are quite similar, quite associated to the Ashkenazic customs. It's just an interesting idea. But the Rosh actually kind of codified the Talmud in a very concise format. Don't want to go into the whole thing now on the breakdown. But the Tur was the first one who kind of put it into 4 separate sections. There was Orach Chaim, which is a person's daily life. So, how you wake up in the morning, and Shabbat, and Yom Tov, and all those various halachot. Then there's Yoreh De'ah, which are the laws of meat and milk and tzedakah and family purity and all those sort of things. Then there is Even HaEzer, which is laws of Gittin, Kiddushin, Ketubot, marriages and divorces and all that sort of stuff. And then there's the final one is Choshen Mishpat, is the laws of the judicial system of taught law, basically. It's interesting to note that the Torah was the one that put it into these 4 sections, and Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, later on kind of adopted this model as opposed to Maimonides' model, kind of like very broad range of sections. But he adopted this model of 4 separate sections in the Shulchan Aruch.
So that's different than
the
the
Torah is
way
like
the
really-
Mishnah is divided up into Shisha sort of
Yeah,
general.
very different. Yeah, it's kind of a Mishnah. Okay, very, very briefly, because it's very important. So you have Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh. You have the oral law and the written law, right? That was both given at Sinai together, yeah, as opposed to the heretics that don't believe that the oral law and the written law are given, hand in hand, and all the commentaries often point out that you look at, an eye for an eye is a classic, the 6th parasha. Yeah, you can't understand these laws without the oral law. So both were given to Moses at Sinai. They were there for 1 year. Moses went up for 40 days, 40 nights. So he started the Torah, and then he came back down, and he gives Ve'ela Mishpatim. Now, with time, that tradition passed over. Tradition, because of the troubles and tribulations which the Jewish people went through, I should point out that at the end of the day, there's a reason why the Torah was given as an oral law and the written law. So why the written law? The written law is because you've got to have something to kind of grab onto. So you have principles, essentially. You have, very broad context of what things mean. We have the whole, so many sarim to explain different, subtleties of the slightest ve'ele, the slightest vav in the pasuk. But there's also another element which is a problem by having a written law. And what's that? When you have a written word, you're very kind of confined into the word that it is. So although Hebrew, the Hebrew language is very different to other languages. Hebrew language, you can say the same thing in one word can mean 5 different things. In French or in English and stuff like that, you can have 5 different words to explain one thing. So Hebrew is a very, very versatile language. So it's very helpful because Lashon HaKodesh, not to be mixed up, not to be confused with modern Hebrew Ivrit. Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew of the Torah. But here's the problem. When you're confined, you can't elaborate and you can't be so broad. So that's why the oral law was given to kind of work in tandem with the written law. Now, the reason why you want to have oral law is because you want to make sure to be so broad. The problem with oral law is it can very easily be misinterpreted. Every guy just hears something else and it kind of messed up. So you have the written law with the oral law. You have certain principles on how you can, what you can learn from, what you can't learn from. And then those two work in tandem. Obviously, you have to be a Talmid Chacham. We say every morning in Shachrit, Rabbi Ishmael Omer, there's certain principles on how we break down understandings of wording in the Torah. Basically, at the time of the Bet Mikdash, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi realized that there was too much going on, and we didn't have space in our mind to kind of internalize the Torah and kind of give it over as the tradition was passed over. And he was worried that the Torah would actually be forgotten. He did something, out of this world, which was very extreme, but it was accepted, across the broad spectrum. And that was, even though there was a Torah prohibition to actually go ahead and write down the oral law for that simple reason, because the Torah was given specifically in that format, yet Rabbi Yehuda Nasi felt that there was a time and need and place to be able to change that format. And he decided to write the Mishnah, which was pretty much Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, in a very concise format. And he kind of put certain things in, certain things out, but even that was written very cryptic, in a very cryptic fashion. That was the Mishnah. After that, still they realized that it's not going to be good enough. People are going to forget even that. So they decided over a period of 400 years, there were so many discussions between rabbis about what their rabbi meant and what the tradition was and so on and so forth. There's so many machloket, so much arguments exactly what the meaning was, that Ravina Rashi eventually put together the Gemara, what we know as Talmud Bavli. There was actually another Talmud which took place, the Talmud Yerushalmi, which took place in Yerushalayim, but the Talmud Bavli became the main element, and kind of that is the breakdown of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which we take from there relevant halachot today. If you want to know what's the halakha of a self-driving car, the ramifications of a self-driving car which goes and smashes into has an accident and kills someone, that would be the same halachot which would kind of put together with Shorsh Nagach, a animal, this week's parasha, which kind of goes and gores another animal or gores a person, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the breakdown, but it's important to know that. Then came the Rambam, who kind of brought it down to halachic principles, real legal law. The Rosh and the Rif, those three were the main people. I'm not going to go into the semantics. Essentially, the Tur put into 4 classifications, and then ultimately what happened was the Shulchan Aruch decided we're going to forget where it came from, so he kind of brought sources to all of those things, and then in the Bet Yosef on the Tur, and later on the Shulchan Aruch kind of brought it down to Tachlis. How do we keep Shabbat? What's the laws? How is it presented? And that's what we have today. And then we have so many commentaries on that. But that's basically the breakdown of from Sinai till today. Okay, that was just in brackets. I didn't mean to talk about that at all, but I think it is important to understand the breakdown of halacha. The reason why I came onto it was because I said the 4 sections of Shulchan Aruch: Orach Chaim, Yerodea, Even Ezer, and Choshen Mishpat. So it's interesting that the beginning of the Choshen Mishpat is the following statement, that the Dayan is supposed to make pshara, is supposed to kind of make compromise before he goes for the full judgment. Yeah. What's the mandate of a judge? First, make a compromise. If you can't compromise, then there's the letter of the law. But in general, when you judge, you have to compromise. You give a bit, you take a bit. And that's how we came to an equal balance. So coming back to the acronym, we said the Balaturim says this is the Balaturim. They say he actually wrote the entire Balaturim in one night. There was a story there. But he's got some incredible acronyms and gematrias and all sorts. Ha-mishpatim, Hey, Hadayan, Mem, Metzuveh is instructed, Shin, Shiyaseh, Pei, Pshara, Tet, Terem, Yud, Yaseh, Mem, Mishpat, quotes the Gemara Sanhedrin, Daf 6b. A Dayan is supposed to make compromise when it comes to, legal laws. So someone's asked, one of the great rabbis, he said, why do we have this concept of compromise? Only the last section of Shulchan Aruch. It should be right at the beginning. You should know. Ve'ele mishpatim. You should come up, finish Har Sinai. You want to know about compromise. It should be that we should know this concept of compromise. And yet, Shulchan Aruch is right the last section of Shulchan Aruch. So he said this is a beautiful idea. He said that's exactly the point. When it comes to compromise, you know what you compromise? When it comes to money. But if you start compromising at the beginning of Shulchan Aruch, you say, Shabbat, we cut corners here, cut corners there. Eating kosher, cut corners here, cut corners there. So that's where compromise is not a thing which we should compromise. And therefore, right at the end, he said, you want to compromise? No problem, but keep it at the end. When it comes to your money, you want to see exactly where your level of connection to God is. Make sure you compromise on things which are less important as opposed to things which are more important. So that's just a sweet idea. But I just want to talk about, very briefly, in the last 10 minutes that we have, about the first parasha which we talk about, of Kitikneh Eved Ivri. So we said it's not really relevant nowadays because we don't buy slaves. But back in the day, it was the norm to have slaves until quite recently, maybe 100 years ago in America, even a little less. there was the concept of servants, of slaves. Now, the parasha which the Torah talks about over here is specifically talking about an Eved Ivri. Now, how would you usually translate that? An Eved Ivri? Anyone? Eved? Eved is a servant.
Hebrew slave.
Ivri?
Eved Ivri,
Hebrew
A
servant.
Jewish slave.
Slave.
Hebrew slave.
yeah,
A
like
Hebrew
in other words,
slave?
so it's a slave that is coming from the same group. How can it be Eved Ivri?
Well, can it be the
Well,
other way
is it-
around? A slave for the Hebrews?
Oh, so you could translate it, Eved Ivri, a slave of the Hebrews, a slave of the Israelites, whatever. It's interesting to note, Eved Ivri is referred to as Ivri and not Eved Israeli. They talk about that. But I think the Ibn Ezra's got a longer discussion about that. But Eved Ivri, Rashi points out, is, look at Rashi Pasuk 2, when you buy a Hebrew servant, this means Eved Shehu Ivri, a servant who is a Hebrew. Ivri, says the Gemara, says Rashi, or perhaps it is incorrect. Perhaps it means a slave belonging to a Hebrew. It says Rashi, Eved Kanaish Katom Israel, which refers to a Canaanite slave. ועליו הוא אומר 6 שנים יעבוד, ומאני מקיים את האחרת למותם, לקוח מן הגוי, ולקוח מישראל יצא ב6. תמוד אומר, כי מכר לך אחיך העברי, לא אמרתי לבחיך. Rashi brings a proof from the Pasuk that we're referring to specifically a Hebrew slave, that means a person who was Jewish, who is an Israelite, and he is sold to another Israelite. And Rashi points out, ki tikneh, when you buy a Hebrew slave, we're referring to miyad bet din, from the hands of a court, shemachru b'gnevato, who sold him for his theft. There are two types of situations where a slave can be bought as a result of two situations. Number one is that he stole, and he doesn't have money to repay back, so he actually gets sold as a result. And there's another situation where a person is so poor, so destitute, that a person can actually sell himself to become a slave. It's important to note that Rashi points out that in this week's parasha, when we talk about the 6 years and the 7th year he goes free, is only referring specifically to an Eved which is sold, a servant which is sold, not a non-Jewish slave, a Jewish slave which is sold under the Bet Din, through the hands of the court, because of something he stole, and then all the halachot of 6 years, and then he gets better treatment, and then he has to go out, and the whole thing of branding his earlobe earmarked, if you want, is put into place. That is very specific, says Rashi, only by an Eved Ivri, which is sold for his slavery.
So Eved that is coming from a different nation doesn't have this protection? This doesn't have this laws?
No. An Eved comes from a different nation, is the regular laws of Avadim, and you buy it, you pay for it. Now the truth is, it's a bit of a liability if you think about it. Someone who actually gets paid, there are laws of Shemitah, which I think next year can have in the land of Israel, the 7th year, the land is fallow, and the laws of Yovel, the Jubilee every 50 years. So now, whatever year you are in the process, that means if it's the 3rd year to Shemitah now, so let's say next year Shemitah, if I would buy an Eved now for, $20,000, then next year you'll already be set free. It's not now he has 6 years. It's from the years towards Shemitah. So really, someone who's buying an Eved, as someone who's buying a servant, is really not great, this whole, it's more worth it from a practical perspective to buy a non-Israelite than to buy an Israelite slave, because the Israelite slave is going to go out very soon. If you buy at the beginning of Shemitah years, it's going to be 6 years. If you buy in the middle, it'll be 3 years, 2 years, or 1 year even.
Maybe the price,
the same price.
but there will be less of a price.
Right. Okay. But I'm saying in terms of, this guy, I want him to be my slave, I want him to work for me. It's quite a, not such a great deal, essentially.
Rabbi, I thought all the time that these laws are in general for all slaves. I didn't realize it's just for Hebrew slave.
Right. We learn new things every day.
Rabbi, I was going to say, is that just one opinion that they're actually Hebrew slaves, or is that the generally accepted principle?
No, that's the Rashi quote from the Talmud. That's the halacha.
Because the same discussion is, I think, made with the two midwives, in Paro and stuff like that. It says they were Hebrew midwives or midwives for the Hebrews. It's same kind of discussion. Were they actually Hebrews or were they not?
Yes. Well, who were they? Right. Interesting you point that out. Okay, I don't remember where Machloket comes from, but it's a good. I suppose I should look it up. Okay, very nice.
Rabbi,
But here the Talmud brings it. This is brought down, codified in Shulchan Aruch.
Rabbi, one more thing. My apologies. I got another meeting at 9, so I got to sign off now. So you're recording this, right? So I'll catch the next. I'll catch the last 5. Okay. Laila Tov, everybody. Sorry, I got to leave.
No worries. So I just want to point out something practical. It's a whole discussion. I just want to point out 2 points. Number one is the Gemara Talmud says that you have to understand what we're talking about. We're talking about slaves. We're talking about, thousands of years ago when slaves were treated as, the bottom end of society. We're talking about even someone, Rashi just pointed out, what type of member of society you're talking about. It's really the lowest levels of society. The guy's gone and stolen, right? He's a robber. And he gets sold by Bet Din, he's caught, and he gets sold to a Jewish household. Now, the Gemara says, Mish kana eved la'atzmo, kana adon la'atzmo. Someone who buys himself a slave essentially ends up buying for himself a master. What does that mean? So if you look through the halachot of an eved, it works out that the eved gets luxuries that the owner himself doesn't even have. For example, says the Gemara, if the owner of the household only has one pillow, says the Gemara, do you know who's going to get it? Not the owner. You have to give it to the slave. You have to make sure he's comfortable. Rashi points out later on as well. He says, "Im begapo yavoy begapo yetzeh. Im baal ishahu v'yatzah ishto imo." Pasuk Gimel. If he's the husband of a woman, his wife's not with him. Ask Rashi, what are we talking about? Why? Says Rashi, you know what? You know who has to pay her stipend? The person who bought the slave. It's a package deal. He was married before. He stole. He messed up. He has to pay for his crimes. But who's going to support the poor wife? The person that bought it. So if you think about it, there are people that, I heard this many years ago in Yerushalayim. He said, you think about it, which nutcase is going to invest in such a crazy deal? I mean, why would you ever want to invest in a servant who he's going to take it first rights? He gets paid holidays, his wife gets paid, he gets out after 6 years, he loves the system, he can marry a non-Jewish wife if he's married already. It's just like one after another. It just makes no sense. And I can't remember who said this. I heard this years ago. He said it's such an incredible idea. He said the type of people who is going to buy this slave is a person who wants to fulfill the mitzvah with Torah of buying a slave. Which type of person is someone who's very, careful about mitzvah with Torah? So there's a big rabbi. He's going to buy a slave. It's going to be a nightmare for him. But he wants to fulfill the mitzvah. But what does this tell us about how the Torah views society? Today, a person goes to prison. What's going to happen? He's done a petty crime. He ends up in prison. Who does he end up in there with? God knows what. The worst of the worst. They go into prison and they come out of prison with they learn all the tricks of the trade and all the crimes from everybody else. Exactly. Oh, what did you come in for? Oh, you forgot to demobilize the cameras. Next time you should go from the back end and you go up the drain pipe and you'll be okay. Whatever it is. Now you can every trick in the book. They come out as much worse criminals than before they went to prison. In the Torah's system, we're going to now, you messed up. Let's try and discipline you in an appropriate fashion. You're going to go. You're going to see what Shabbat looks like. You're going to see how halakha is so careful in the most mundane matters to make sure you're comfortable. You're going to see how a person treats their wife. You're going to see how people treat their children. You're going to see how to act appropriately. And you're going to learn from this person how to act. And then you go home and put it into practice. In terms of what that means, I think it's incredible. In the lesson of how we can train our children, how we educate ourselves to make sure we learn from an example. Just one final point in the last minute we have. The obvious question is what Eyal started off with. What's the connection? Why over here do we talk about Ivri? I would have pointed out the Rashi, but we're not going to now. Basically, Rashi says that if he doesn't want to go after 6 years, this guy gets branded, he gets earmarked, literally, by the door, and he says, and then he can stay till the Jubilee. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, the Mashgiach in the Meir Yeshiva, he says, I don't understand. Why was it brought down over here? What's the connection between the parashiyot? Not only that, he says, Rashi says, why do he brand his ear, not his finger? Why do he brand his, his right earlobe? Says Rashi, because the same ear that heard at Sinai that you are my slaves and not yours, and the same ear that heard at Sinai you must not steal, that's the ear has to get a message. So asks Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, I don't understand. There's a big problem over here, because if you look back at last week's parasha, 10 Commandments, the 10th commandment, one of the commandments about Lo Tignov is not referring to stealing. Pasuk about stealing is much later on. Lo Tignov, Rashi points out from the Talmud, is a pasuk which talks about kidnapping. Ask Rashi, ask Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, I don't understand. We're talking about kidnapping over here. And you're saying that this ear that heard about kidnapping, you should have listened and not want to be a slave of God and not a slave of a master. What's that got to do with anything? That's kidnapping. You're talking about stealing. What's one got to do with the other? So he says such a beautiful idea. I think it's really incredible. He says, you know why? It's because this person, he's also, if you want to brand him at the beginning as soon as you come in. Why only if you want to stay, you get branded after the 6 years? He said that the two answers answer each other, two questions answer each other. When we're talking about a person who is kidnapping, stealing, who is he stealing from? He didn't kidnap anyone. But I'll tell you who he kidnapped. He kidnapped himself. What does that mean? You've kidnapped yourself because you should have been serving God. Instead, you messed up and you don't want to serve God anymore. You're very comfortable in your surroundings. So you're a slave to yourself. Ki tiknei ivri is referring to a person's own slave mentality inside them. I think it's really beautiful. We say every morning, Baruch atah Hashem shelo asani avet, that every morning we make a blessing. That thank God you didn't make us a slave. Slave? Who's a slave around here nowadays? But the truth is, I think to every one of us, it can talk very practically. We all have an element of slavery. I mean, how many of us are so addicted to our phones? How many of us, when our kids want to talk to us, that's all, sorry, the phone's more important. Or our spouse wants to talk to us, the phone's more important. I'm sorry, I just got a message. I'm on the phone. How many times do I see people, you talk to them to their face, and sorry, I've got a call. Well, why is the person on the call more important to you when I'm speaking to you? Yeah, it just doesn't make sense, but we're enslaved to society's whims. We're enslaved to so many elements of society, and I think that's really a practical lesson in terms of slavery, what it means to us. God says, Avadaihem v'lo avadim, be my slave, God says. I took you out of Egypt, and that's why it's over here. It's connected directly. When do we teach you this element? When you're still here now. And why is that? Because you know what? When a person has a nice maidservant, can you imagine you have a nice cleaner or a nice maidservant at home, and you wake up every morning, your bed's done 100%, your slipper's in the right place, and the dishes are done, the washing machine. And then you're going to tell me, no, listen, by Shemitah, you had this for 2 years. Sorry, you got to get rid of him. He won't be able to keep it. God gave him this Torah now while they're in the desert, when they can relate to this element, when they can relate to the fact that I was just a servant. I know what it means to be a servant. Don't give it to the guy when it's like, it's so hard for him, and I get to, oh, okay, you know what, just give it back. There's a right time and a right place for everything. I think it's also a fascinating idea. Lakol zman va'et Shlomo Melech says. God says, understand and appreciate. You just came out of Egypt. Now you understand the slave mentality. You understand how hard it is. Now I tell you, come the time, you'll go to Israel. You'll have the laws of Shemitah. You'll have the laws of Yovel. That's when you're going to have to say, give the guy a chance, give him a break. He'll learn from you, get a break. And that's so many different lessons, but we can learn from it as personal things of Avdut, and also to know when to say something. I think in every relationship, and whether it's our kids or whether it's our spouses or whether it's just friends, sometimes we say something, it's just not the right time. Sometimes you could say the right thing, but it's not the right time. Something you say that it could be the right time, it's just not the right thing. L'kol zman va'et, says Shlomo Melech, ve'ele hamishpatim, starts with everything free. Why now? Because you just came out of Egypt. Now is the time where you can understand. Not right then when you're in it and you're ready, the dishes are washed, and I say get rid of it. No. Right now, before you get into the situation, that's when it is. Okay, we'll stop it.
Rabbi, I'm going to have to say good night. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you very
Good
much.
night.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.